It didn't begin in Washington or New Delhi. It began in the quiet of an early morning as the first rays of sunlight touched the streets of Mumbai and the markets of London and New York were still asleep. Traders poured coffee into paper cups, expecting a routine day. And then a single headline flashed across the ticker. Burkina Faso signs $14 billion grain deal with India. For a moment the financial world froze. Burkina Faso, a small landlocked nation in West Africa, long associated with gold, cotton, and endless political struggles, had suddenly stepped onto the world stage as a supplier of life itself, food. 20 million metric tons of maize and sorghum pledged over 10 years. No speeches, no slogans, just 3 paragraphs of cold, simple numbers, and yet those numbers hit harder than any political declaration. Within minutes, grain prices jumped in Chicago and Mumbai. Analysts rushed to live television, calling it a historic shift, a game changer. South America and Eastern Europe, once dominant in feeding Asia, felt a chill down their spines. Because out of nowhere, Burkina Faso, a country without a coastline, had claimed a place in the global food order. But this is about more than trade. It is about power, resilience, and the rewriting of Africa's story. Why would India, a nation already rich in grain, sign such a massive deal with a country once dismissed as too poor, too unstable, too far from the sea? And what does this tell us about the new role Africa and leaders like President Ibrahim Traoré are carving for themselves in a changing world? Stay with me until the end, because this is not just a deal. It may be the beginning of a new chapter in global history. Please share if you feel that you are one of the first to know about and support President Ibrahim Traoré. And subscribe if you believe that the truth is more important than the headlines. The official announcement was surprisingly short. No speeches, no fanfare, just 3 paragraphs. 20 million metric tons of grain, $14 billion in value, 10 years of supply. Sometimes the simplest words create the loudest noise. Within hours, the world's financial heartbeat quickened. Screens in trading rooms from Mumbai to Chicago lit up red and green as grain futures spiked. Analysts who thought the day would be quiet were suddenly on live television, struggling to explain how a country most had ignored just yesterday was now shaking the very foundations of global food markets. For decades, Burkina Faso had been described in narrow terms: landlocked, resource-poor, politically fragile, known more for gold mines and cotton fields than for wheat, maize, or sorghum. Yet here it was, stepping forward not as a victim of global markets, but as a producer shaping them. Why did this deal matter so much? Because it wasn't supposed to happen. India is a grain giant, producing hundreds of millions of tons every year. On paper, it does not need imports, but reality is more fragile. India's food system depends on the monsoon. When the rains are good, warehouses overflow. When the rains fail, shelves empty and food prices soar. That boom and bust cycle leaves over 1 billion people vulnerable. Burkina Faso offered something India could not ignore: climate diversity. The rains that drench West Africa do not follow the same pattern as South Asia's monsoon. A bad year in India does not mean a bad year in Burkina Faso. By linking their harvests, India bought itself a safety net against climate change and uncertainty. But there was another reason. This was not just a deal of numbers, it was a deal of recognition. For India, it meant security. For Burkina Faso, it meant identity. Until now, few had considered this small nation as a reliable supplier of food. But by committing 20 million tons over a decade, Burkina Faso declared to the world, "We are more than gold and cotton. We can feed the future." Almost instantly, rival exporters began to calculate their losses. Argentina, Brazil, and Ukraine had long dominated Asia's imports. Suddenly, an African country had cut into their share. Some analysts warned of a looming price war, with exporters forced to slash rates to keep contracts. Others saw something deeper: a redistribution of power in the food system, one that would make the world less dependent on a handful of traditional suppliers. Yet behind the headlines lay years of preparation. This agreement was not born overnight. 3 years earlier, Burkina Faso's leaders began quietly attending international trade and food security forums. They came not with flashy promises, but with steady words. They spoke of untapped land, of resilient farmers, of crops grown with care. Indian officials listened. Trust not money was the first currency exchanged. Step by step, confidence grew. Indian delegations visited Burkina Faso's central plains, ran their hands through sacks of grain, inspected silos, and spoke with farmers. Could supply remain consistent? Could quality be guaranteed for 10 years? The answers slowly became yes. The greatest obstacle was geography. Burkina Faso has no coastline. To deliver grain across oceans, shipments would have to move through neighboring countries, onto trains and trucks, through ports, and finally to Indian harbors. At first, many doubted this was even possible, but the very problem became the foundation of cooperation. India agreed to co-invest in infrastructure. Railways were upgraded, roads repaired, port storage expanded in nearby coastal states. Logistics that once seemed impossible turned into symbols of trust and innovation. And that perhaps is why this deal stunned the world. Because it wasn't just about maize and sorghum. It was about rewriting the story of a nation long overlooked. In one morning, Burkina Faso was no longer only a headline about conflict or poverty, it was a headline about capacity, resilience, and global relevance. For India, the deal brought protection. For Burkina Faso, it brought pride. For the rest of the world, it raised a profound question: if even a landlocked African nation can rise to become a critical player in feeding billions, what else is possible? The most dramatic challenge lay not in fields or silos, but in geography itself. Burkina Faso is landlocked. For every ton of grain promised, there was the same haunting question: how will it reach the ocean? Skeptics were quick to pounce. Rival exporters in South America and Eastern Europe dismissed the deal as impossible. They can sign all the papers they want. One analyst in Buenos Aires sneered on live TV, but without a port, it's just fantasy. In Kyiv, trade consultants warned that India was taking a reckless gamble. Even in West Africa, neighbors wondered how convoys of trucks could cross borders without chaos. And yet, instead of retreating, Burkina Faso and India turned the problem into an opportunity. Within months, engineers were walking rail tracks, planners were mapping road corridors, and investors were pouring funds into coastal infrastructure. Rail lines stretching to ports in Ghana, Togo, and Côte d'Ivoire were upgraded. Storage silos rose like concrete giants near harbors that had long been neglected. What once seemed an impossible barrier became the very foundation of cooperation. This transformation marked the deal's climax. Suddenly, the world understood this was not just about grain, it was about building a logistical bridge across borders, about giving a landlocked country the arteries of global trade. Every mile of track laid, every new road paved, was a declaration Burkina Faso would not be confined by geography. The reactions were swift and heated. In South America, headlines read, "Burkina Faso steals our market." Argentina and Brazil, long the breadbaskets of Asia, feared losing contracts worth billions. Their farming lobbies pressed governments to slash prices and offered discounts to hold on to Indian buyers. Analysts whispered of a coming price war, one that could shake global food markets for years. Eastern Europe too bristled. Ukraine, already battered by war, saw the deal as a direct challenge to its dominance in supplying Asia with maize. Officials complained quietly that India was turning its back on trusted partners. But in truth, what they feared was not just lost revenue, it was the symbolism. That a small African nation had leapt onto the stage they once controlled. Meanwhile, in the financial centers of New York and London, the mood was half awe, half alarm. Futures traders scrambled to adjust models. A new variable had entered their equations, one they had never factored before: Burkina Faso. But perhaps the loudest reactions came not from boardrooms, but from the fields and villages of West Africa itself. Across the region, farmers in Mali, Niger, and Senegal asked the same question: if Burkina Faso can do it, why not us? Suddenly, the impossible looked possible. The sight of new rail lines and expanded silos ignited ambition far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. For India, the high point came when television anchors declared it a masterstroke. By choosing Burkina Faso, New Delhi had not only secured food stability, but also outflanked rivals. China and the Gulf states had signed agricultural contracts across Africa for years. India, once slow to act, now showed it could lead too, and with a partner that asked for respect, not subservience. The symbolism grew even stronger when observers compared India's approach with that of other global powers. Where others tied trade to military bases or political conditions, India framed the deal as one between equals. That distinction resonated across Africa, and so the climax was not just in the signing of the deal, nor in the surge of grain prices, nor even in the building of railroads. It was in the perception shift. Burkina Faso, once dismissed as too poor, too unstable, too far from the sea, was now seen as a pioneer, proof that Africa could defy the odds. For rivals, it was a threat. For neighbors, it was an inspiration. For India, it was insurance. And for Burkina Faso, it was vindication. No matter how bold the headlines, one question echoed across the streets of Ouagadougou and the dusty villages beyond. If we export so much grain, will our own people still have enough to eat? It was a fair fear. Burkina Faso is not a nation of plenty. In recent decades, droughts and shortages had scarred its history. Families knew the pain of empty markets and inflated bread prices. To suddenly pledge 20 million tons abroad stirred both pride and anxiety. The government understood this dilemma. In the fine print of the agreement lay protections. A fixed percentage of Burkina Faso's annual harvest would be reserved for domestic use, untouchable by export contracts. No matter how high global prices soared, that share could not be sold abroad. Beyond that, revenue from the deal would fund food subsidies, irrigation projects, and new silos designed to reduce waste. In theory, the country could both feed its own and supply the world. Still, ordinary citizens reacted with a mix of hope and caution. Farmers in the Central Plains smiled at the promise of better prices and guaranteed buyers. For the first time, we know our harvest will not rot, one grower said. Yet in the markets, mothers worried that grain prices might rise before the subsidies arrived. The deal's success, many believed, would depend on whether ordinary households felt the benefit or just watched trains full of maize roll past them toward distant ports. Politically, the implications were even greater. The $14 billion agreement became a symbol of independence. For decades, Burkina Faso's economy had been tethered to Western donors and foreign aid. Now it stood before the world as a partner with leverage, not as a client state. Choosing India and not Europe or America was itself a declaration Burkina Faso would decide its partners on its own terms. This repositioning resonated throughout the African continent. In Dakar, Bamako, and Niamey, journalists asked, if Burkina Faso can strike such a deal, why not Senegal, Mali, or Niger? A wave of conversations began about agricultural potential, long ignored. Leaders quietly studied how to replicate the model, secure long-term buyers, upgrade infrastructure, insist on equal terms. Burkina Faso's achievement was no longer just national pride, it was a regional inspiration. Yet with inspiration came pressure. Opposition figures at home warned that the government might be over-promising. Some critics asked whether the state had the capacity to manage such complex logistics without corruption or mismanagement. Others pointed to security challenges, insurgent violence in the Sahel that could disrupt harvests and undermine deliveries. In Parliament, debates grew heated. Was this truly a national opportunity, or was it a gamble too large for a fragile nation? For President Ibrahim Traoré, the political stakes were high. If successful, the deal could secure his image as the leader who turned Burkina Faso into an agricultural power. If it failed, it could become a weapon for his opponents, proof that ambition had outstripped reality. And yet beyond politics, the emotional impact was undeniable. Across villages, farmers spoke of dignity. To be recognized not only as laborers in fields, but as suppliers to the world carried weight. A woman in Koudougou put it simply, they used to laugh at us. Now they need us. In that shift of perception from forgotten corner to global contributor lay the true civil and political consequence. Burkina Faso had entered a new era, one where its choices mattered not only at home but on the world stage. From the outside, the deal between Burkina Faso and India looked like a straightforward trade agreement, but in Washington, Brussels, and London policymakers read it differently. To them, this was a geopolitical tremor, one that hinted at a world where Africa no longer played by the old rules. For the United States, the symbolism was hard to ignore. For decades, Africa had been treated as a recipient of aid, not as an architect of supply. Washington's food security programs often framed African nations as dependent on American grain or Western financing. Yet here was Burkina Faso standing alongside India, delivering not just promises, but millions of tons of food to one of the world's largest economies. The question whispered in congressional offices was unsettling. If Africa can feed Asia, how long before Africa no longer needs us? The European Union faced a similar unease. Ukraine, long positioned as a vital supplier of grain to Asia, now faced competition from a country that few in Brussels had ever taken seriously as an exporter. Officials privately worried that if Burkina Faso's model succeeded, other African nations might follow, eroding Europe's influence in global agriculture. More broadly, the deal signaled a diversification of markets that could weaken Europe's bargaining power. China watched with caution. For years, Beijing had poured billions into African agriculture, striking land and resource deals in exchange for infrastructure. But this agreement was different. India had approached Burkina Faso as a partner of equals, not as a landlord. That distinction mattered especially as African publics grew wary of dependency on any single outside power. For global institutions like the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization, the news carried a note of optimism. Diversifying food supply across continents reduces the risk of shortages when climate change or war disrupts a single region. From their perspective, Burkina Faso's entry into global markets was not just good for Africa, it was good for the world. And yet the reactions were not purely economic. There was something deeply political in this partnership. Choosing India over Western buyers showed that African states could carve their own alliances independent of traditional colonial or neo-colonial ties. It was a subtle but unmistakable rebuke to the West. Africa will not be told where to sell its harvest. For older Americans, this may feel familiar. The echoes of the Cold War are present here, when nations once dismissed as peripheral suddenly became battlegrounds of influence. Only this time it is not military bases or missiles at stake. It is grain, water, and food security, the essentials of survival. At the center of this shift stands President Ibrahim Traoré. For many in Africa, he has become the symbol of a new sovereignty, young, unyielding, and willing to place his nation at the center of global negotiations. To Western observers, he is a disruptor breaking patterns that once seemed unshakable. To his supporters, he is proof that Africa can rise not by imitating others, but by charting its own course. And so for the United States and Europe, the lesson is clear. This is not simply about one contract. It is about the future of global order, where alliances are redrawn, where Africa is not a footnote but a chapter in the story of world power. Sugged. In the end, a short press release transformed into a thunderclap heard across continents. Burkina Faso, once dismissed as landlocked and powerless, has shown the world that even nations written off by history can rise to shape it. What began as a grain deal is now a mirror reflecting not only Africa's potential, but also the fragility of the systems we have long trusted. The warning is clear. In a world of climate shocks, volatile markets, and fragile supply chains, no country is untouchable. For decades, Americans assumed our food system was immune to foreign shifts. But if a single deal between Ouagadougou and New Delhi can send ripples through Chicago's trading floors, then we too are vulnerable to the choices of nations we once overlooked. The question is not whether Africa can rise, it is whether we are ready for what that rise means. President Ibrahim Traoré's bold move raises deeper questions. Can Burkina Faso truly balance feeding its people while feeding the world? Can a country long exploited by outsiders now set the terms of trade in its favor? And for us in America, the question cuts even closer. Are we prepared for a century in which Africa, not the West, holds the keys to global stability? This is more than economics. It is about dignity, sovereignty, and the right to define one's future. For Africa, it signals a turning point, no longer a silent participant in global trade, but an active architect of it. For the rest of the world, it is both an opportunity and a challenge to engage with Africa as a partner, not as a dependent. So I leave you with this. Do you believe President Ibrahim Traoré's national reform strategies are truly effective yet? Or is this bold step just the first in a long and uncertain journey? Can we continue to trust him as the face of Africa's rising sovereignty, or should we expect another leader to carry the torch forward? Please share this video if you feel you're among the first to recognize and support President Ibrahim Traoré's vision. Subscribe if you believe that truth matters more than headlines. And leave a comment. Is this deal the dawn of a new era or just a storm before the calm? Because in today's world, even a handshake in a landlocked corner of Africa can reshape the fate of billions.